All right. So we know the rules differ between the liquidation of a corporation when it's a corporate subsidiary versus when it's done by the individual shareholders. So now we got to talk about the corporate subsidiary, and the rules are very different. So there's still non-recognition, or sorry, there is non-recognition of gain or loss on distributions of property by a subsidiary to its parent corporation in a complete liquidation, to which 332 applies. And 332 is just the liquidation rule. So what happens is the parent corporation instead, the basis carries over along with the tax attributes like recapture, depreciation, etc. The parent corporation does not recognize gain or loss on the liquidation of a subsidiary. And the subsidiary recognizes no gain or loss on property distributions to its parent. So this is the exact opposite, if you will, of the liquidation of a corporation to its individual shareholders. So in order to qualify for this treatment under 337, the parent needs to own 80%, right? We're back to this 80% rule of the voting stock and the total value of other stock. And the subsidiary distributes all of its property in a complete with liquidation within the taxable year or within 3 years, and the subsidiary is solvent. So obviously, if the subsidiary is not solvent, then there's a chance you're paying back your creditors, actually, and that's a very different treatment. So because then it's not really a liquidation, it's more like that worthless stock thing we talked about. So as I mentioned, the tax attributes carry over. So the basis of the property to the sub, simply the parent steps into the shoes of the subsidiary and takes over their basis. The E&P of the subsidiary becomes the E&P of the parent. So the parent's investment in that sub simply evaporates, and that's going to have some consequences as we work our way into some of these acquisition related things, and certainly with reorgs as well. So let's say parent P has a basis of 100,000 in subsidiary T stock. T's basis in its own assets is only 40,000, and the fair market value of T's assets is 75,000. So if P liquidates T into P, right? So they're liquidating their corporate sub, and we're of course assuming that it's 80% owned. In this case, it's 100% owned. The amount realized would be 75,000 less the adjusted basis in the stock of 100,000. So there would be a $25,000 loss outside of 337. However, that loss is gone. It simply evaporates because P's basis in the sub evaporates. And instead, P just takes over that property at basis. So what T's basis in the assets was 40,000. And so now P just takes over those assets at 40,000. And no gain or loss is recognized by T or by P. So there must be a complete liquidation. The corporation needs to cease to be a going concern. They can continue to operate activities as long as they are merely for winding up its affairs, paying the debts, and distributing any remaining balances. A legal dissolution is not required, although that is certainly indicative of a complete liquidation. The T, right? So this subsidiary can retain a nominal amount of assets simply in order to preserve legal existence, and that will not taint the liquidation. So, for example, in some countries and maybe in some states, you're required to have a minimum net worth. And, so maybe they keep $100 worth of net worth in the corporation. So as a result, as long as it's nominal, you can retain that and it's still considered a complete liquidation, even though obviously, you haven't absolved the legal dissolution of the corporation. There absolutely should be a plan. Otherwise, you follow 3 rules. You got to demonstrate intent to liquidate. There has to be a continuing purpose to terminate corporate affairs and dissolve, and all corporate activities were directed toward that purpose. So the easier way to do that is just have a plan, right? Have a written plan of corporate liquidation. So what are the requirements of 332B? The corporation receiving the property must own a specified amount of the distributing corporation stock. We talked about that again. We'll talk about it some more. There needs to be a complete cancellation or redemption of all of the stock of the distributing corporation, and the transfer needs to occur within time limits. So that 80% ownership rule is the test we talked about. 80% total voting, 80% value of all other. And the steps that you could take if you were trying to avoid 332, or perhaps, trigger 332, is, of course, you can purchase and or sell shares in the subsidiary to get above or below 80%. So, if you had a 90% interest, you could sell, a 10.01%, get below 80%, and suddenly 337 would no longer apply, and the subsidiary would be liquidated, and it would not be tax-free, right? So there would be gain and loss to all the parties involved. So again, we talked about this complete cancellation or redemption, and it doesn't really need to be complete, but you better have a good cause if you're not doing so. And as I mentioned, one of them would be to preserve its legal existence. Sometimes, you don't want to eliminate the corporation because there might be hidden liabilities. It might have some sort of branding that's associated with it. You don't want someone else to take it over. The timing of the distribution must provide for the transfer of all property within 3 years from the close of the taxable year in which that first liquidating distribution is made. And if there's no plan, you need to do it within a year, because otherwise it's going to call into question whether you really were engaged in a liquidation. Because remember, this liquidation changes the rules, right? Otherwise, it's a dividend, perhaps, or at least you would measure it to see if dividend rules apply. All right, what if instead, sorry, I got to move my little box here. There we go. What if instead the liquidation is in payment of debt? And we talked about this, right, where the subsidiary is insolvent. And so let's say the parent had loaned the subsidiary 100. The fair market value of the subsidiary's assets were 80. It was insolvent, and then they decide to do this kind of transaction in order to close down the subsidiary. In this case, you would view it as the transfer of the assets from the sub to the parent was made in satisfaction of the indebtedness. And so as a result, none of this is relatable to the stock interest. And so as a result, it's not a 332 at all. Recall that the subsidiary doesn't recognize gain or loss on the distribution of property to the parent. But what if there's a liquidating distribution out to minority shareholders, and those minority shareholders by default have to own less than 80% because they have to own 20% or less. So the subsidiary corporation would be treated the same way as in a non-liquidating distribution. So the distributing corp would recognize gain but not loss, right? So you're going to treat it as a non-liquidating distribution to the minority shareholder. And the minority shareholders are going to recognize gain or loss with the amount equal to the fair market value of the property received less the basis that they have in that stock. So what that means is you can have a 337, but with minority shareholders, they're going to be treated as if it's a regular liquidating distribution to some extent. So P corporations own 90% of X. J owns the other 10. So X has assets with a basis of $1 million, fair market value of $3 million, which are going to be distributed to P and J in liquidation. So what is P corporations recognize gain on the liquidation? Well, it's a 337, right? This is the liquidation of a subsidiary into a parent corp. They own more than 80%, so there'd be no gain or loss, for that matter, on the liquidation. What is what is X Corp's recognized gain on the liquidation? Well, X Corp has a basis, right? Actually, it doesn't say. What is X Corp's? Oh, X Corp is the target. Sorry. X Corp's recognized gain on the liquidation. Well, the $3 million minus the $1 million is the total amount, right? But because there's only a 10% minority interest, they have to recognize 200,000 or 10% of that realized gain. And what is Jay's basis in the assets received? Well, Jay's going to take the fair market value of 3 million again times 10% or $300,000. So you can see that what happens is we kind of bifurcate the liquidation of the subsidiary into two parts. One, this 337 liquidation of subsidiary, and the other is more like a regular corporate liquidation. All right, we'll stop there. Only 10 minutes. Pretty good.